Select Subcommittee is undergoing a hearing as we speak on what they call investigating the proximal origin of a cover-up. We will react to that hearing with molecular biologist Alina Chan and investigative reporter Jimmy Tobias tomorrow. But until then, U.S. Right to Know Emily Kopp of the U.S. Right to Know organization, she's testifying on the Hill today, and she tweeted about a report released by this same committee, some major revelations here in that report on efforts to suppress the lab leak theory, which include new Slack messages making it clear that the intent of the infamous proximal origin paper was expressly political. Specifically, the idea was to downplay the accidental release theory. And Emily Kopp suggests here it was actually about appeasing, in fact, the Chinese. So there are Slack messages in this report that's from this Christian Andersen figure who's, this is the paper that Fauci kind of pushed for, hinted that he'd really like someone to write a paper about how natural origin is really the more likely explanation. Christian Andersen was part of that, and so this is a quote from him. I hate when politics is injected into science, but it's impossible not to, given the circumstances. This other scientist, Dr. Rambo, says that given the SHIT that show that would happen if anyone seriously accused the Chinese of even accidental release, my feeling is we should say that given there is no evidence of a specifically engineered virus, we cannot possibly distinguish between natural evolution and escape, so we're content with ascribing it to a natural process.
Oh, it's
That's pretty damning. That's like, we don't want to accuse the Chinese, like they would, if we said they did it accidentally, they would freak out. So, and we're not going to say that it was deliberately engineered and released, so we'll just say short of that, that's pretty bad.
That sheds some interesting light on the way that the wet market, despite it implicating more Chinese cultural practices than a lab leak theory, was the one that was characterized as the more pro-China argument, and this sheds light on why that might be the case. Remember, the posture at the time is the mainstream pushing natural origin, Donald Trump talking about a China virus, this effort to, perhaps it seems now from that Slack thread, minimize the direct accusations going against China for political reasons, wanting to de-escalate any tensions that might emerge, either out of a sincere effort not to antagonize a world power, or because it also means being kind of anti-Trump in the way that he was choosing to address this issue. That makes it a lot easier to understand how we could have ended up in a situation where lab leak theory was perceived to be the more xenophobic, sinophobic explanation, as opposed to
because that was going to make the Chinese government mad.
Exactly.
Emily also highlights in this report another Dr. Ron Fauci, who was also involved in Proximal Origin, quoted. So this is another quote from this person. This manuscript would be much stronger if it focused on the likelihood of the first two scenarios as compared to intentional or accidental release, but also limit the chance of new biosafety discussion that would unnecessarily obstruct future attempts of virus culturing for research and diagnostic purposes. So they're explicitly saying they want to head off calls for new biosafety regulation.
That's wild. I mean, I am more open than I think you are to the idea that there can be potentially a safe way to do gain-of-function research. I would need to know a lot more about the science and safety protocols, the pros and the cons, the benefits of the research, and the risk of leak to come to a determination about whether or not I think that we should just fundamentally not do gain-of-function research. But the idea that in the face of a tragedy, the likes of COVID, you wouldn't be eager for there to be as many safety protocols and effect as possible for your own sake as a researcher, as well as for the global community's sake, is kind of perverse. Yeah. It really seems like the more we learn about the timeline for Fauci and Collins and all the and happening earlier than we thought. As soon as there is any evidence there's a pandemic, they're like, okay, how did this arise? What are let's put the brain trust together and see if we can come up with an explanation that does not impugn
our scientific
but the argument should be, if you want to continue gain-of-function research, you should be pushing aggressively for more safety protocols and making the argument that it can be done safely.
Antarctica.
Do it, exactly, exactly.
So do it on the space station.
100%. Elon, get him on the phone. Or the deep under, maybe not under the sea. Can you tell me a little bit more about who it is exactly that's on those email threads? Help me understand how senior, perhaps, some of the people who are making those statements are.
These are people who are part of a group of scientists who are, convened to weigh in, to contribute their expertise for this Proximal Origins declaration, which set the tone then for media coverage, for ensuing media coverage and legislative, like, oh, well, it could have been, you weren't crazy to wonder if it was a lab leak or whatever, but the scientists looked at it, and here's their paper saying, it's
And this was assembled by who exactly?
Well, that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of, but we know that there were calls between Fauci, Francis Collins, and others too. So we're trying to assess how much it was Fauci saying, do you think this was, natural origin? And if so, would you write a paper about it? And pushing, I don't remember if it was Anderson or one of the others, to do that, even though they initially said, I would not be inclined to weigh in. And then Fauci's like, are you sure?
Yeah.
And that's again, no one's alleging like criminal action here, but that it was, that there was an agenda being set by Fauci and others to steer the conversation, at least when it was ambiguous, when it was more ambiguous than, frankly, than I think it is now, again, given unconfirmed, but substantial accusations made about illnesses among the implicated scientists, prior to the wet market.
Have we heard much from China? Are they also having an internal conversation?
Well,
there's diplomatic missions that are ongoing. There's obviously an entangled scientific relationship between the U.S. and some of these Chinese labs. What do we know if it's just a presumed natural origin and not a lot of discourse in China about, or is there an ongoing investigation there in the way that there is?
Well, we don't know.
Here?
I presume they've investigated it. If those scientists did get sick, they probably know. So I think
Ben Wu came out saying that he wasn't grounds patient zero.
Sure.
Do what you will with that. But so there obviously are people who are able and willing to speak, and I would imagine that there has to be some public statement that indicates that there was an effort to get to the bottom of it, whatever you think about how credible it is.
It is likely that the Chinese authorities know way more than we do, and are just not sharing, because it makes them look bad. That's the theory. It's a compelling theory.
It just seems like such shared responsibility with these jointly funded, these U.S.-funded labs and Chinese scientists.
They took down. There was. I don't remember quite what the relevance of it was, but there was a publicly available genetic profile of COVID-like diseases that they had available. That they took that down immediately as the bit like there. It's a secretive. And again, I'm not saying this in like a xenophobic way. Our own health agencies have also been extremely reluctant to admit that they might be at fault here.
No, that's what I'm saying. That I almost feel like it's so mutually assured destruction that's an argument for why both states are happy to.
Both states have incentive to keep it ambiguous and say. Now they have to say that. Well, it might have come from a lab, but it might have come from wet market. Might have,
It is interesting.
Fallen
Ryan
from
Grimm,
a shooting star. Who knows?
Ryan Grimm has been live watching these hearings. We've been catching it between, filming here as well. And he was remarking on how interesting it is that it's completely split among partisan lines, with all the Democrats arguing in favor of natural origin and all of the conservatives arguing in favor of lab leak, and how this is not an intrinsically political issue and it shouldn't pan out that way. And if there is a state-based investment in not having U.S. liability, right? If there's a kind of national investment and there not being U.S. liability, the same way there is potentially in China, it is still curious why that is falling along partisan lines? Like, what did the Democrats know about wanting to avoid liability that Republicans don't know or not care about? Is it just the Democrats more interested in maintaining the integrity of the organization and having an NIH or a CDC versus Republicans? Because I suspect that the average Republican doesn't want there to just not be a National Institute of Health and cancer research. And, RFK Jr. is so popular among a lot of different people of a lot of different political backgrounds because he's arguing that we need to have more testing for vaccines, not get rid of the agencies that would be able to implement that kind of testing. So it's just a really interesting dynamic.
I think the Republicans have rallied around the lab leak theory because, it's a little bit of a gotcha of turnaround is fair play to the mainstream media demonizing anyone who thought it was plausible as a kind of conspiracy theorist, as they did to Tom Cotton and anyone on the right who said that. So maybe there's an overinvestment in
Jeffrey
that idea.
Sachs, they pilloried. He was heading up Lancet's investigation, and he said, well, let's look into lab leak. Everybody freaked out because he was senior and respectable and had a medical journal and open to lab leak before a lot of other people were. Thomas Frank, I did an interview with him in the early days where he was getting a lot of pushback for being, it was a mess. And I definitely appreciate people who are still bristling about that.
I've just had to include, based on the description of the research they're doing, the conditions we know, the substandard conditions in the lab, the fact that the intermediate animal has not been found in the wild, even though it was for SARS. Those things all together make me really, really leaning heavily toward the lab leak. But of course, we don't know for sure. We will bring you more on that hearing with an expert tomorrow. And on tomorrow on Rising, yes, we will have the people we mentioned on our show. It will be great. We hope that you tune in and you can listen to us in all sorts of places. Why don't you tell the audience where those places are?
Here, Rob, you're stepping on my lines here. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who prefer to listen while you're on the move, we're now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.